My name is Gina Aubrey. I am 40 years old, and for 11 years I worked as a paralegal in a small law office in Millbrook, Ohio. I spent most of my adult life reading contracts that ruined families, divorces, estate disputes, custody agreements, business dissolutions. I watched brothers sue brothers over farms. I watched daughters stop speaking to mothers over jewelry. I watched people smile across conference tables while planning how to destroy each other in court. But none of those files prepared me for what my sister did to my daughter. 4 months ago, my mother died. Her name was Ruth Aubrey. She was 72 years old, a retired third-grade teacher who smelled like lemon lotion and peppermint tea. She spent most of her life taking care of people. Then, near the end, my daughter Sophie took care of her. And because my mother believed gratitude mattered more than obligation, she left everything she had to Sophie. The house. The savings. $240,000. One yellow house on Maple Drive. One decision. One sentence in a will that shattered our family. To my granddaughter Sophie, who was here when it mattered. My older sister Debra got nothing. And Debra decided that was unacceptable. The first call came 48 hours after the will reading. I was sitting on the edge of my bed folding laundry when my phone lit up. Debra. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Hello? Her breathing was sharp. We need to talk about this. No greeting, no grief. Straight to the money. Talk about what? The will. There was a pause. Then, carefully rehearsed, Mom wasn't thinking clearly when she signed it. I closed my eyes. There it was. The beginning. She had a capacity evaluation, I said calmly. The attorney confirmed everything. A sick old woman can still be manipulated. I sat up straighter. What exactly are you accusing Sophie of? I'm saying she lived there. She had an influence. Influence. Such a clean word for such an ugly accusation. I looked down at the towel in my hands. Sophie had cooked my mother dinner every night for nearly 2 years. She had changed sheets, sorted medication, driven her to chemotherapy, sat beside her hospital bed during nights when the morphine made her confused and frightened. If that was an influence, then maybe the world needed more of it. Mom made her choice, I said. You think this is fair? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because fairness had never mattered to Debra until money entered the room. Growing up, she had always been the favorite. Beautiful. Charming. Quick with compliments. Quick with excuses. Our father adored her. He called her his golden girl. He called me his quiet one. When Debra forgot birthdays, people forgave her because she smiled while apologizing. When I forgot something, it was remembered for years. That was our family dynamic. Debra sparkled. I handled the cleanup. Debra, I said slowly, Mom left what she wanted to leave. Silence. Then, you always thought you were better than me. There it was. Not grief. Not heartbreak. Competition. The same competition that had existed since we were children. Only now it involved my daughter. This isn't about me, I said. Everything with you is about you. She hung up. 2 hours later, Sophie called crying, and that was when I understood this was not going to stay private. Sophie was 21 years old. She had my eyes, my stubbornness, and my mother's patience. When she was little, she used to line up her stuffed animals and pretend to give them checkups. She always wanted to help people. That never changed. She moved into my mother's house at 19 during her second year of nursing school, not because she wanted an inheritance. Because she needed stability. And because my mother was getting weaker. At first, the arrangement was practical, a spare bedroom. Shared groceries, help around the house. But practical things become emotional very quickly when illness enters a home. My mother had pancreatic cancer, the kind that moves quietly until suddenly it owns everything. By the end of the first 6 months, Sophie was managing medication schedules. By the end of the first year, she was helping her shower. By the final months, she slept in a chair beside the bed. Debra visited 3 times. 3. I remember every visit. The first time, she brought flowers and left after 40 minutes. The second time, she spent more time discussing property taxes than asking about Mom's health. The third time, she walked through the house slowly like someone evaluating a real estate listing. She stood in the kitchen staring at the hardwood floors. "This neighborhood has gone up in value," she said. Mom was sitting 6 feet away in a recliner, too tired to hold a conversation. Debra didn't notice. Or maybe she did. That was worse. One evening, Sophie told me something while folding laundry. "Aunt Debra was talking outside on the phone," she said quietly. "About what?" "The house." I stopped folding. "What exactly did she say?" "I only heard part of it. She was talking to Ray. She said, if Mom changes the will again, we're screwed." Ray was Debra's husband, a man who believed volume was intelligence. I folded another towel slowly. "Don't worry about it," I told Sophie. But I did. I worried from that moment on. The funeral was small. 42 people. A church built for 300. Snow covered the sidewalks outside. The air smelled like wet wool and carnations. Debra arrived 20 minutes late wearing dark sunglasses she never removed, even during the prayer. Afterward, she hugged people dramatically, pressed tissues to dry eyes, accepted casseroles. Performed grief beautifully. Sophie stood beside me the entire time, silent and exhausted. When the funeral ended, she helped carry flower arrangements to cars. Debra left early. A week later, we sat in Harold Kimball's office for the reading. Harold had known my mother for nearly 20 years. He spoke carefully, deliberately. The office smelled like coffee and old paper. Debra sat across from me with perfect posture. Confidence. Prepared. I think she already believed she knew what the will contained. Harold adjusted his glasses. Then he read, "The house on Maple Drive and all financial accounts totaling approximately $240,000 would pass to Sophie Marie Aubry. Directly. Sole beneficiary." Then came the line. "To my granddaughter Sophie, who was here when it mattered." I looked at Sophie. Her eyes filled immediately. Not because of the money. Because my mother had seen her. Really seen her. Debra sat perfectly still. No tears, no anger, just stillness. Harold asked whether anyone had questions. Debra said no. Then she stood up and walked out. That silence lasted exactly 2 days. After the phone calls came the rumors. Debra started contacting relatives one by one. Uncle Tom in Pennsylvania, Aunt Linda in Kentucky. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. She told them Sophie manipulated a dying woman. She said I was orchestrating everything. She said Mom had been confused. And people believed her, because Debra had always known how to sound believable. That was her gift, not honesty, conviction. There's a difference. One afternoon, my cousin Ellen called me. "Is any of it true?" I stood in my kitchen staring out the window. Rain slid down the glass. "No," I said simply. "Debra sounds really hurt. Hurt people can still lie." Ellen hesitated. "I just don't know what to think." I understood that. Because manipulation works best when it mixes emotion with uncertainty. That's how people get pulled into stories they never questioned enough. By the second week, Brenda, Ray's mother, posted vague Facebook messages about greedy people taking advantage of elders. No names, no details, just enough. Small-town gossip spreads faster than truth because gossip asks nothing of people except participation. Truth requires thought. And thought is work. I went to see Robert Webb on a Monday morning. Robert was 55, senior estate attorney, sharp mind, quiet voice, the kind of man who noticed details other people ignored. He listened while I explained everything. The calls, the rumors, the accusations. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Your mother's will is solid," he said. Debra won't win in court. She isn't going to court, I replied. He nodded slowly. She's trying to pressure Sophie instead. Exactly. Then Robert said something that changed everything. We should audit your mother's accounts. I frowned. Why? Because people who challenge themselves emotionally sometimes have financial motives they've already acted on. 2 weeks later, the records arrived. 6 withdrawals. $15,000. Taken while my mother was in hospice care. 3 withdrawal slips carried signatures that looked almost right. Almost. But not enough. I knew my mother's handwriting. I had seen birthday cards and grocery lists for 40 years. Those signatures were forced. Too careful. Too strong. Robert arranged a preliminary handwriting analysis. The result came back 3 days later. Inconsistent with known samples. Forgery suspected. I sat in Robert's office staring at the report while my stomach turned. Not because I was shocked. Because I wasn't. That was the worst part. Somewhere deep down, I had already known. 2 days before the family meeting, Sophie found the letter. My mother kept a cedar jewelry box on her dresser. It smelled like old wood and rose lotion. Inside were pearl earrings, church brooches, and tiny memories from a long life. Sophie lifted the velvet lining, searching for the pearl brooch. And underneath it sat an envelope, her name written across the front. Dear Sophie. I drove to Maple Drive immediately. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, holding the letter carefully with both hands. Like it might break. I opened it slowly. My mother's narrow cursive tilted slightly right across yellow legal paper. I knew her handwriting instantly. The first line punched the air from my lungs. If you are reading this, then the will has been read, and Debra is angry. I kept reading. Your aunt borrowed over $80,000 from me across 15 years. None of it was repaid. Last March, while I was hospitalized, money disappeared from my savings account. I know who took it. I did not confront her because I no longer had the strength for those fights. But love should not become a debt someone collects on. At the bottom, show this to your mother. She will know what to do. I folded the letter carefully, and in that moment my grief changed shape. Because now I understood something clearly. My mother had not simply rewarded Sophie, she had protected her. Saturday arrived cold and gray. Sophie wore a white blouse and dark slacks. She pinned my mother's pearl brooch to her collar. I remember looking at her before she left. She looked older than 21, not mature. Burdened. I parked 2 blocks away. Robert waited nearby in his sedan. We had a plan. If Debra tried anything, I would signal him. Sophie entered the house alone at 2 o'clock sharp. Minutes later, she texted. There's a lawyer here. I replied immediately. Do not sign anything. Then I waited. Those 10 minutes were the longest 10 minutes of my life. Finally, I walked up the front steps and opened the front door. The scene looked exactly how Sophie described it later. Debra on the couch, Ray by the window, Brenda in the recliner. A lawyer named Neil Pratt seated at the dining table. And my daughter is sitting alone in the armchair. A legal document waiting on the coffee table. The moment I entered, Debra's expression changed. You weren't invited, she said. My daughter was, I replied. Neil attempted professionalism. This is a private family discussion. A private family discussion with legal paperwork and no independent counsel? I asked. Interesting strategy. Sophie looked relieved the second she saw me. I placed my hand on her shoulder, warm, shaking slightly. The document on the table was exactly what I expected. Voluntary relinquishment of estate rights. 2 pages. Sign here. Give away everything. No compensation, no negotiation, just surrender. I texted Robert. Now. 90 seconds later came the knock. Measured. Professional. Robert entered the room like a judge walking into a courtroom. The atmosphere changed instantly. Neil Pratt recognized the name immediately. You could see it. Fear disguised as discomfort. Robert reviewed the document silently. Then he placed it back on the table. "This agreement has no legal standing," he said calmly. "And any signature obtained under these circumstances would be highly contestable." Debra lost control after that. The performance cracked. Because manipulation only works when everyone agrees to pretend it isn't manipulation, and Robert refused to pretend. I opened my briefcase. The sound echoed through the room. I removed the bank statements first, one by one. Dates highlighted. Amounts circled. $15,000. Then the handwriting report. Then my mother's letter. The room changed with every page. Debra's confidence drained visibly. Ray stopped speaking. Brenda stopped interrupting. Even Ellen, who arrived expecting dinner instead of an ambush, looked stunned. When I read my mother's words aloud, Debra finally broke, not gracefully, not dramatically, completely. She slid to the floor beside the couch. "Ray left me," she whispered. The room went silent. She explained everything, mortgage payments behind, debt piling up, 3 months from foreclosure. Fear, panic, desperation. And for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered Sophie crying at my kitchen table. I remembered my mother too weak to hold a coffee cup while someone forged her name. Pain explains behavior. It does not erase responsibility. "You could have asked for help," I told her. "Instead, you tried to steal from a dying woman and intimidate a 21-year-old girl." Debra cried harder, but nobody moved toward her. Not even Brenda. Because sometimes the truth enters a room so completely there is nowhere left to hide. The money was returned within 10 days. No apology accompanied it. Just a wire transfer. $15,000 appearing silently in Sophie's account. Robert filed the appropriate notices. The estate finalized in April. Sophie moved into the house officially. She painted the guest room pale blue, turned my mother's bedroom into a reading room, kept the cedar jewelry box on the top shelf beside a framed photograph. The lemon tree in the backyard started budding again by spring. Sunday dinners returned. Quietly. Carefully. Not the same. But real. Ellen came often after that. She apologized sincerely. Not everyone did. Some relatives stayed distant. People prefer simple stories. Debra had given them one first. Changing opinions requires effort many people never make, and honestly, I stopped caring. Because protecting my daughter mattered more than preserving comfortable illusions. There's something people misunderstand about quiet women. They think silence means ignorance. It doesn't. My mother saw everything. She saw Debra borrowing money for years. Saw excuses. Saw manipulation. Saw charm weaponized into obligation. And she also saw Sophie, a 19-year-old nursing student, helping her bathe when chemotherapy left her too weak to stand. A young woman reading mystery novels aloud because trembling hands could no longer hold books. A granddaughter who stayed. That mattered to my mother. Presence mattered. Effort mattered. Consistency mattered. Not performance. Not entitlement. Not birth order. And in the end, she left behind something far more valuable than money. Clarity. The kind that arrives too late for arguments. People always asked the wrong question after everything happened. They asked, how could Debra do something like that? But that wasn't the real question. The real question was, how had Debra spent 45 years becoming the kind of person who believed she deserved what belonged to someone else? The answer started long before my mother got sick. Long before the forged signatures. Long before the family meeting. It started in childhood. Debra learned early that charm could erase consequences. If she forgot chores, she smiled. If she lied, she cried. If she hurt someone, she explained it beautifully enough that people comforted her instead. Our father rewarded that behavior constantly. When Debra brought home a C- report card, he called her creative. When I brought home an A-, he asked what happened to the missing points. That difference shapes children. One learns they are loved automatically, the other learns love must be earned through competence. I became organized, reliable, responsible. Debra became persuasive, and persuasion can be dangerous when paired with desperation. She married Ray at 26. At first he seemed stable, loud but hardworking. Then the layoffs started. Then the gambling. Then the refinancing. Then the borrowing. Always borrowing. My mother paid off their credit cards twice, covered overdue utility bills, loaned money for roof repairs, medical expenses, car payments, every time Debra promised repayment, every time my mother believed her. Not because she was foolish, because mothers want to believe their children. That hope becomes expensive. The final Christmas before my mother died felt strange even then. Debra arrived carrying expensive wine she could not afford. Ray carried a giant poinsettia, still wearing the grocery store sticker. Sophie had spent the entire morning cooking. Turkey, green beans, mashed potatoes, homemade rolls. My mother sat near the fireplace, wrapped in a cream blanket, looking smaller than I remembered. At one point, Debra stood near the kitchen doorway watching Sophie wash dishes. "You've made yourself pretty comfortable here," she said. Sophie glanced up. "Grandma needs help." "That's not what I meant." I heard the conversation from the dining room. I walked into the kitchen immediately. "Need something, Debra?" She smiled instantly. Too quickly. Just complimenting Sophie. But her eyes had already drifted toward the hallway leading to my mother's bedroom. Toward the office, toward the file cabinet, toward the future she thought she deserved. Later that evening, after everyone left, my mother called me into her room. "Debra scares me sometimes," she whispered. I sat beside her bed. "Why?" She looked toward the doorway to make sure nobody was listening. "Because she always wants something." That sentence stayed with me after she died, not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. A week before the family meeting, Sophie nearly gave in. She came home exhausted after clinical rotations. Her eyes were swollen. Her shoulders sagged. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. We sat at the kitchen table, eating reheated pasta. Neither of us had much appetite. "Aunt Debra came to campus again," she said. I froze. What happened? She waited outside the nursing building. My chest tightened instantly. "Did she touch you?" "No. She just stood there and said Grandma would be ashamed of me." I looked at my daughter carefully. She looked cornered, not angry, worn down. That's how pressure campaigns work, not through one dramatic event, through repetition. Embarrassment, isolation, exhaustion. Eventually, the target starts believing surrender might be easier than survival. "Maybe I should just give her something," Sophie whispered. I set down my fork. "No. Mom, no." She looked at me with tears forming again. "I'm tired." I softened immediately. "I know." Then I took her hands. "Listen to me carefully. Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. You are not carrying stolen money. You are carrying her decision. There's a difference." Sophie cried quietly, and I realized something important. People think inheritance fights are about greed. They aren't. They're about emotional endurance. The person who lasts longest often wins. Debra understood that. But so did I. The morning after the confrontation on Maple Drive, I woke before sunrise. For the first time in weeks, the house felt quiet. Not peaceful, but quieter. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter staring into darkness. My phone remained silent. No accusations, no texts, no new rumors. Silence after conflict feels strange, like walking out of a storm and suddenly hearing your own breathing again. At 8:30, Ellen called. "I didn't sleep last night," she admitted. Neither had I. "I keep thinking about Aunt Ruth writing that letter alone," she said. I swallowed hard. "Me too." "Did you really not know about the money?" "Not all of it." Ellen sighed. "I feel stupid." "You trusted family." I said. That's not stupidity, but privately I wondered whether trust and denial sometimes look identical. 3 days later, Ray showed up at my office parking lot. I had just finished work when I spotted his truck near my car. He leaned against the driver's side door smoking. I almost turned around. Instead, I walked toward him calmly. "You shouldn't be here," I said. He flicked ash onto the pavement. "Debra's a mess. That's unfortunate." He narrowed his eyes. "You humiliated her." I laughed once. Short. Sharp. "No, Ray. Debra humiliated herself. I just refused to let her do it to my daughter instead." He looked tired suddenly, older. "You don't understand what pressure does to people." I stepped closer. Pressure reveals people. That shut him up. For a long moment, he stared at the pavement. Then quietly, "I didn't know about the signatures." I believed him. Not because Ray was honorable. Because he was too sloppy for forgery. That kind of careful deception belonged to Debra. "You still participated," I said. "I know." Then he walked away. And I realized something strange. The collapse had already started before the meeting. We had simply turned on the lights. Sophie transformed my mother's bedroom slowly. Carefully, like grief required patience. She donated old medical equipment, folded blankets, organized drawers. But she kept certain things exactly the same. The floral curtains, the bedside lamp, the framed wedding photograph of my parents. One Sunday I arrived carrying groceries and found Sophie sitting in the reading chair beside the window. A mystery novel rested open in her lap. Sunlight touched the pearl brooch pinned to the curtain tie-back. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded. "I was thinking about Grandma." I sat beside her. "What about?" The last thing she said to me. My throat tightened instantly. "What was it?" Sophie smiled sadly. She said, "Thank you for staying." That sentence nearly broke me. Because my mother had known she was leaving, known Sophie stayed anyway, and gratitude matters most when someone owes you nothing. Months passed before I heard from Debra directly. Not through relatives, not through lawyers, through voicemail. It arrived on a Thursday evening. I listened standing beside the sink. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "I know you probably won't call back," she said. Long pause. "I just wanted to say I know I ruined everything." Another pause. "I kept thinking if I could just get the house, I could fix my life." Her breathing shook. "But I think my life was already broken." Then silence. No dramatic apology. No excuse. Just exhaustion. I didn't call back immediately. Not because I hated her. Because forgiveness without accountability becomes permission. And I refused to teach Sophie that lesson. 3 days later, I sent a short text. "You need therapy more than money." That was all. She never responded. Small towns remember scandals longer than funerals. By summer, everyone in Millbrook knew some version of the story. Versions varied. Some said Debra forged signatures. Some said Sophie manipulated my mother. Some said the entire family had become greedy. Most people only cared because conflict entertains them. That's another thing I learned. People consume other families' pain like television. At the grocery store, women lowered voices when I passed. At church, certain conversations stopped abruptly. I ignored it. Because protecting peace sometimes means refusing to audition for public sympathy. One afternoon at the pharmacy, an older woman touched my arm gently. "Your daughter took wonderful care of your mother," she whispered. I recognized her vaguely from hospice visits. I saw her there every week. My eyes burned unexpectedly. Because after months of accusations, hearing someone acknowledge the truth felt overwhelming. Not dramatic, just human. Sophie graduated nursing school in May. The ceremony took place in the college gymnasium. Blue gowns, metal folding chairs, too many balloons. I cried the second they called her name. Not politely, openly, because I remembered every night she studied at my mother's kitchen table while hospice equipment hummed in the next room. Every morning she woke early to help before class, every sacrifice nobody else saw. After the ceremony, Sophie hugged me tightly. "Grandma should be here," she whispered. I touched the pearl brooch pinned to her dress. "She is." And somehow, I meant it. People think protecting someone means violence, aggression, threats. But often protection is paperwork, preparation, patience. It's reading every page carefully while someone else relies on emotion. It's teaching your daughter not to sign under pressure. It's showing up at the right moment. It's carrying evidence instead of rage. The briefcase mattered because preparation mattered. My mother understood that. She couldn't fight Debra physically. So she documented. She planned. She wrote the truth down while she still could. And in the end, those pages protected Sophie better than anger ever would have. One evening in June, Sophie baked lemon bars using my mother's recipe. The smell filled the Maple Drive house exactly the way it used to. For a few minutes, grief bent strangely around memory, almost soft. Ellen sat at the kitchen table drinking tea. "Your grandma would be proud of this," she told Sophie. Sophie smiled. She always said extra powdered sugar fixes everything. We laughed. And I realized healing doesn't arrive dramatically. It enters quietly. Through dinners, recipes, small, ordinary moments surviving after chaos. If another mother asked what I learned from all this, I would tell her this: teach your children the difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt says, keep everyone happy. Responsibility says, protect what matters. They are not the same. I spent years teaching Sophie kindness. What I nearly forgot to teach her was boundaries. That changed after Maple Drive. Now she understands something many adults never learn. Love without boundaries becomes exploitation. And family is not exempt from that truth. Especially family. Late one night in August, I drove past Maple Drive after work. The porch light glowed warm against the dark. Inside, I could see Sophie moving around the kitchen. Home. Safe. That mattered more than the inheritance itself, because the money was never really the point. Security was. Stability was. A future free from fear was. My mother understood that better than anyone. She knew Sophie needed a foundation. And she knew Debra would consume anything handed to her without accountability. The will wasn't punishment, it was protection. 6 months after the family meeting, Debra finally came to the house. Not dramatically, no lawyer, no accusations. Just Debra, standing on the porch holding a grocery store bouquet. Sophie answered the door first. I happened to be there helping repaint the hallway. When I saw Debra through the doorway, every muscle in my body tightened automatically. She looked thinner, tired, human. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. Sophie looked at me. I nodded once. Debra stepped inside slowly. She stared around the living room. The same clock, the same curtains, the same family photographs. Only the atmosphere had changed. The house no longer belonged to memory. It belonged to Sophie. Debra noticed the reading room immediately. She stood in the doorway looking at the bookshelves, at the cedar jewelry box, at my mother's photograph. Then she started crying. Real crying. Not polished, not strategic. Messy. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Sophie remained quiet. Debra wiped her face. "I don't expect forgiveness." That was the first honest sentence I'd heard from her in months. We sat in the kitchen afterward, drinking coffee awkwardly. Nobody discussed the inheritance. Nobody mentioned the signatures. Some wounds require silence before language can return. When Debra left, Sophie exhaled shakily. "Do you think she meant it?" she asked. I considered carefully. I think she finally understands what she lost. Here's the thing about entitlement. People think it comes from arrogance. Sometimes it comes from fear. Fear of instability. Fear of failure. Fear that without external validation or financial rescue, your life might collapse entirely. Debra built her identity around being admired. When admiration disappeared, she reached for ownership instead. If she controlled the house, the money, the estate, maybe she could still feel secure. But security stolen from someone else never lasts. Because underneath theft sits panic. Always. By autumn, Sophie started working at Millbrook Regional Hospital. Night shifts, long hours, exhausting work. But she loved it. One evening, she came home carrying flowers from a patient's family. They said I reminded them of Grandma, she told me. I smiled. That's the highest compliment anyone could give you. She laughed softly. Then she asked something unexpected. Do you think Grandma knew this would happen? I thought about the hidden letter, the changed will, the careful wording. Yes, I said finally. I think she knew exactly who everyone was. People ask why I tell this story now, because stories like this happen constantly. Not always with forged signatures, not always with lawyers in living rooms, but with pressure. Manipulation. Family members weaponizing guilt against the people least prepared to defend themselves. Young adults, widows, caregivers, quiet people. And too often nobody intervenes. Everyone says, we don't want drama. But silence is not peace. Silence is permission. On the anniversary of my mother's death, Sophie and I visited the cemetery together. Snow dusted the ground lightly. The same weather as the funeral. We brought fresh flowers and stood quietly beside the headstone. Ruth Eleanor Aubrey, beloved mother and teacher. Sophie touched the cold granite. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know whether she meant the inheritance, the house, the protection, or simply the love. Maybe all of it. Before we left, I looked at the grave and thought about the final months of my mother's life, how tired she had been, how observant, how quietly strong. And I realized something. The real inheritance she left Sophie wasn't money.